Hi, this is Bay McFarland with Mary's Advocates, and we are working to reduce unilateral no-fault divorce, support those who are unjustly abandoned, and I'm here to explain to you the ongoing saga, the plot continues, of the controversy between Mary's Advocates and Cardinal Coccopalmerio. Give you a little background. In all my research findings, I have found that for those who participate in the Catholic marriage ceremony, you're supposed to have your bishop's permission before you file in the civil form for divorce. And the reasons for that have to do with how marriage is a public thing, it's not private. Divorce is really just a case of separation of spouses. For Catholics, we need the intervention of a person who's got the job title of a promoter of justice when you have a separation of spouses, because kids are involved and obligations towards each other and children are involved. You might have heard of an annulment case where someone's challenging the validity of the marriage. They need the intervention of a person who has a job title of defender of the bond. Well, in separation of spouses cases, promoter of justice. I'm in the Diocese of Cleveland, and when I started my research around 2003 and 2004, our bishop was Bishop Pella, and shortly afterwards we got Bishop Lennon. Bishop Pella had been in charge of the USCCB, and I had found documents going back to 1999 in our diocese where it's saying that we've got this template petition where someone could petition for an intervention of the church regarding separation of spouses. However, there's no penalty for not using the petition, there's no penalty for not invoking the bishop, and this is contrary to the canon laws that are in effect right now in the United States, which go back to the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore in the late 1800s, which say it's those who petition in the civil form for divorce without first getting the bishop's permission incur grave guilt. And that's Article 126. There's also an Article 123 that says the church has competence to decide parties' obligations in cases of separation, marriage cases, and also in cases of invalidity of the marriage. So that was back to 1999. Fast forward, in 2017, Mary's Advocates published a flyer. Sorry, this was 2016. 2016, I publish a flyer. It's a little trifold flyer, and in my flyer I say you need the bishop's permission to file for, before you file for civil divorce. And I went to my bishop and I asked him to check my flyer. And in canon law, which makes sense, bishops are responsible to make sure we're not publishing nonsense and saying it's Catholic Church teaching. So I asked my bishop, will you please, on the administrative track, look at my flyer and let me know if I can get your approval that it doesn't contain anything contrary to faith and morals. What happened is I got no response after a time. The law says they're supposed to give you an answer within 3 months. I emailed the diocese. I got an email back from the judicial vicar, Father Gary Yanis, who got his doctorate in canon law in 1990. He wrote me saying, we don't have an answer yet from the bishop. And then months go by, and I get an answer from an employee who is a direct report to Father Gary Yanis, and the employee says, hey, Father Gary Yanis wants me to let you know that the bishop is not approving your flyer. And I knew at that point that when they condemn a writing as containing something harmful to faith and morals, the author has a right to understand the reason why, probably so the author could fix it. So I knew I could make recourse after 3 months of not getting an answer. So I went to the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, and to the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith I was asking for help because I was needed to know the reason why the bishop was saying my flyer would not get his approval. Now, I knew when I was doing all of this that I was pushing the envelope, and this goes back to 2015. In 2015, what color can I use here? I guess I will use red again. In 2014 and 2015, Pope Francis had his Synod on the Family where he invited, over 100 bishops to come and talk about the family. In 2000, and that was the big controversial thing with the Mid-Synod report where they were talking about how homosexual acts or homosexual activity or whatever has good things in itself. In 2015, I was invited to speak in Rome. So I don't know how to put me at a podium, but here's me at a podium. Just make do. And I was invited to speak at a conference. It was actually a symposium, a scholarly symposium where people are presenting papers. You give a shortened version and, oh, that's my phone, forgive me. I presented my paper in September 2015 The symposium had a welcome letter from Cardinal Raymond Burke. I was the only one talking about canon law. All the papers that were presented were printed up in a paperback book and distributed to all the bishops who participated in Pope Francis' Synod on the Family. Yeah. And a couple months later, in November, this letter comes out from Cardinal Coccopalmerio. And Cardinal Coccopalmerio works at he's the president of the Pontifical Council for the Interpretation of Legislative Texts. And the letter is only signed by him. I'm just going to call it Coccopalmerio Coco for short. And, here I am in Rome presenting my paper, and I'm talking about how there's canon law that protects us from unilateral no-fault divorce. Catholics are not supposed to be petitioning for civil divorce without getting church intervention first. And Cardinal Coccopalmerio wrote a letter where he turns my research findings upside down. So I give you this background because I knew when I was asking my bishop for permission on my flyer in 2016, and when I went to the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, when the bishop didn't give me any answer, but didn't give me any reason, I knew at 2016 that I was pushing the envelope because there was this letter signed only by Cardinal Coccopalmerio at the Pontifical Council for the Interpretation of Legislative Texts, who turned my research findings upside down. So, after I wrote to the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith, time goes by. I let the bishop know that I wrote to the CDF. The bishop does send me a letter giving me a reason why he's not going to approve my flyer. He's not going to approve my flyer because my research findings are contrary to the writings of Cardinal Coccopalmerio. And he says, I'm not going to have any more discussions with you, Mrs. McFarland, until we get an answer back from the CDF. Now, at the CDF, I was technically making a recourse after being aggrieved by an administrative decision that happened after an administrative procedure. And there's rules about how these things are supposed to go, so both parties' rights are protected. And I was making recourse after being aggrieved by an administrative decision of my bishop. The CDF should have undergone an administrative proceeding. I had a right to a canon lawyer defending me. Well, what happened is instead a letter signed by one person again. So here now we've got a letter signed by one person, but this is not Cardinal Coccopalmerio's letter. This letter is signed by Monsignor Morandi. So Morandi. Monsignor Morandi at the CDF, signed only by him, says, your letter from your bishop is well-founded, and I know the letter from the bishop was saying, Cardinal Coccopalmerio says the opposite of what you're saying, Bay. So after that happened, I never really had an administrative proceeding at the CDF. I never had a singular administrative decree from the CDF. I had a letter not from the president, not from the secretary, but from the undersecretary, Monsignor Morandi. So then our bishop retires for health reasons. We get a new administrator in our diocese. So in 2017, my markers are not working as well as I want. 2017, I'm at it again. I got my trifold flyer. I have some more footnotes in it supporting my research findings. I still say you need the bishop's permission before filing for divorce. I go to the bishop, who was now the administrator from the neighboring diocese, Bishop Thomas. I ask him to look at my flyer, and he comes back and he says, hey, Mrs. McFarland, I can't approve your flyer. Didn't you already do this before? And didn't you get an answer from the CDF? This time, before I went to the bishop, I gave him boatloads of research, going back to the Council of Trent and documents from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith that had a different name centuries ago. I've got information about countries where they do have a concordat treaty between the country and the church, where there has been a circumstance where you did not need to go to the bishop to get permission to file for civil divorce first, and that was in a country where the church knew that the government was issuing decisions that were in accord with divine law in cases of separation of spouses. So I had given the bishop boatloads of information, thinking this time, if he's going to compare my writings to Cardinal Coccopalmerio's, he's going to have a reason to support what I'm saying. But, he comes back and says, Mrs. McFarland, you already got an answer back from the CDF, Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith, saying no to your flyer. Now, the distinction the bishop didn't make is that I never really had a singular administrative decree from the CDF. I never had an administrative procedure at a CDF. I got a letter, which was the opinion from one member, one personnel, a person who works there, the Undersecretary, Monsignor Morandi. So, being very conscientious about windows opening to make recourses, after getting that answer from Bishop Thomas, I asked the CDF to help. I got silence. So then I went to the Signatura. And at the Signatura, I gave them all the back and forth correspondence between me and Bishop Thomas, Signatura. And at the Signatura, they're responsible for making sure there's not errors in procedure or decision-making in all the dicasteries of the world. So I was asking for them to give me my chance to make my case, where I'm presenting my writings in contrast to Cardinal Coccopalmerio's writings, and I could show all the reasons why I say what I'm saying, supporting it with citations, Council of Trent, popes, other magisterial teachings, and let's ask Cardinal Coccopalmerio to do the same thing, and then see what happens when we have a vote from a plenary or ordinary session at the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. That's what, in the end, canon law allows for someone like me to have, because I'm making an appeal on the administrative track. But what happens is, before you get a judgment at the Signatura, the secretary is kind of like a gatekeeper, and he has the competence and responsibility to notice whether someone has a right to be there, based in law at all. And what happened is the secretary, Bishop Sciacca, I'm sorry, I'm not going to get his name correct. I don't know how to pronounce it. Sciacca. I'm just going to call him the gatekeeper secretary of the Signatura. He came back and said, we're going to stop you right now in limine at the doorpost before you move in, because you don't have any right to be here, because the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith already gave you a decree earlier on the similar issue, and you can't ask the same question twice. Well, I don't even know if the secretary gatekeeper at the Signatura ever studied the document that came from the CDF to which Bishop Thomas was referring, because the document from the CDF was not a particular administrative decree wherein there was any advocate upholding my rights, where there was any back and forth, where the parties got to argue to support the petition. All it was the opinion of the undersecretary. Nonetheless, when the secretary at the Signatura rejected my right to be there, to make an appeal at all, the next step one has is to argue that he was incorrect. And there's a group called the Congresso that you can appeal to at the Signatura about this kind of thing. In order to even go this far at the Signatura, you've got to pay a €1,550 fee deposit to the Signatura. You also have to hire a procurator, advocate, canon lawyer. Parties do not represent themselves in front of the Signatura. Somebody donated to Mary's Advocates to cover these costs. So it was about €4,000 plus fees and taxes. So it was upwards of about $5,000 that someone donated so that we could have our chance to uphold our rights, because as it really was, literally, when a bishop tells an author that we can't give you an imprimatur and give you permission to publish your writing, they're telling the author that you've got positions that are contrary to longstanding, harmful to faith and morals as portrayed by the magisterium. So Mary's Advocates is found guilty of this, but I've never had a chance to defend myself. The only thing that's happening is Cardinal Coccopalmerio's one-page letter is being used against me. So I just learned like a week and a half ago, if even that, that the Congresso at the Signatura is not going to overturn the rejection by the gatekeeper who says you don't have a right to be here. And the basis for it was that there is this principle that once you've got an administrative decree after an administrative procedure that gives you a decision, you have one chance to make your appeal, and you need to make the appeal within peremptory deadlines after you get the decision. Well, in my situation, I never had a singular administrative act from the dicastery of the Congregation of the Congregation of the Faith. Well, that's too long of a sentence. I never had a legitimate decision from the congregation. I had a one-page letter, which was the opinion of one person, the undersecretary. So now you see why I decided to use visual aids instead of trying to write this out, because it's so convoluted. It's easier to understand, I think, when I just explain it. I'm waiting to hear from the canon lawyer whether he thinks my options are open to go back to the secretary, maybe asking him to change his mind about, because the information he had from Bishop Thomas was incorrect. Bishop Thomas said I had gotten a decision from the CDF when I really only got an opinion from an undersecretary. And we shall see where this goes. My hunch is that to move forward on this, I'm going to need someone to donate to Mary's Advocates another $5,000. Maybe I can do it just as an individual entity, at least to try. But in order to get any kind of actual hearing at the Signatura, they won't even let you get a hearing until you make a deposit. So that's where things stand. The saga continues between Mary's Advocates and Cardinal Coccopalmerio.